Mind in the Fog, a bedtime tour of the lore of the great detective. Here is a strange and wonderful paradox to carry with you into the dark tonight. It's the most famous reasoning mind in all of fiction. A man so coldly and perfectly logical that he became the very definition of the word, was dreamed up by a gentle doctor who himself believed with his whole heart in fairies and ghosts and messages from the dead. The most rational character ever written was born from one of the most magical imaginations of his age, and tonight, slowly and quietly, through the gaslit fog of old London, I am going to walk you through the whole strange and comforting lore of how that happened. But before we step out together into the fog, let me ask you the small question I always like to ask. Wherever you happen to be lying right now, in whatever city or quiet room in whatever far corner of the world, tell me down in the comments where you are listening from tonight. Because there is something lovely in knowing how far this little voice travels while the world is falling asleep. And once you have, let your shoulders sink into the pillow, and we will begin. Let me say first what this is and what it is not. We are not going to solve any of the famous cases tonight, or retrace the clever puzzles you may already know. We are going to do something gentler and, I think, far more interesting for a tired mind. We are going to treat this detective as if he were a real historical figure, and study his life, his methods, his city, and the curious immortality he somehow achieved, the way you might wander a quiet old museum after closing, by the light of a single green-shaded lamp. So let us begin at the beginning, which is a very humble place, okay? The Great Detective first appeared in print in the year 1887 in a slim story tucked into a Christmas magazine, written by a young and struggling physician named Arthur Conan Doyle. He was a doctor with very few patients, and he wrote in the long, empty hours of an unvisited surgery, simply to pass the time and to make a little money. He had no idea, none at all, that he had just opened the door for a man who would outlive him by a century and more, and who would, in the end, become far more famous than his own maker. And the detective's astonishing method, the thing that makes him feel almost supernatural, was not invented out of thin air. It was drawn from a real and living man. When Doyle had been a medical student in Edinburgh, he had studied under a brilliant surgeon named Joseph Bell, a teacher who could look at a stranger walking into his clinic and tell, before a single word was spoken, the man's occupation, his recent travels, his habits, and his ailments, all from the calluses on his hands and the mud on his boots and the set of his shoulders. Teal watched this real man perform what looked like magic, and he understood that it was not magic at all. It was only attention. And he built an entire immortal character on top of it. The whole body of his adventures is, in truth, rather small, which surprises people. There are only 4 novels and 56 short stories, 60 works in all, written across roughly 40 years. Devoted readers came to call this collection, with great affection and a capital letter, simply the canon, as though it were scripture. And it is a remarkable thing that so vast a shadow, so enormous a cultural presence, should be cast by so modest a body of work. Most people who feel they know the great detective intimately have never actually read a word of him. He has grown far larger than the pages that made him. Most of those adventures first reached the public in the pages of a single monthly magazine, appearing one self-contained story at a time, month after month. And in doing so, the great detective quietly invented something we now take entirely for granted. Doyle hit upon the idea of a single recurring character whose individual adventures were each complete in themselves, so that a reader could pick up any month's issue and enjoy a whole story from beginning to end, while also being drawn back again and again by the growing affection for the man at the center of them, a familiar hero, a familiar set of rooms, and a fresh, standalone mystery each time. If that structure sounds familiar to you, it should, because it is the exact shape of nearly every series we love to this day. The comforting pattern of a world and a companion we return to whenever we please, where each visit is its own complete little journey. He did not only father the detective story, he helped invent the very rhythm of episodic storytelling itself. The warm reliability of coming home to the same beloved place again and again to hear a new tale told by the fire. Now, let us go to the rooms, because the rooms are where the warmth lives. He lodged at a set of cluttered, comfortable apartments at number 221B Baker Street, in the heart of old London, kept by a long-suffering and kindly landlady. Those rooms have become, by now, perhaps the most famous address in all of fiction, a place that millions of people can picture without ever having been there. The chemistry apparatus bubbling in the corner, the papers stacked on every surface, firing the grate, the fog pressing against the windows, Dean to worn armchairs drawn up close. It is one of the coziest imagined spaces ever built, and it is a lovely place to sit in the mind as you grow drowsy. And it is important that there are 2 armchairs, not one, because the great detective is never alone. The stories are not told by him. They are told by his friend and companion, the steady, decent, brave old army doctor who shares his lodgings, and through whose ordinary and admiring eyes we watch the genius at work. This was a stroke of quiet brilliance on Doyle's part. Oh, we do not stand inside the great mind, which would spoil all its mystery. We stand beside it, exactly where the reader stands, always one step behind, always astonished. The doctor is us. He is the warm and puzzled every man who lets the cold genius shine. It would be a mistake, though, to think of the good doctor as merely a device, a plain pane of clear glass for us to look through. He is a fully drawn man in his own right, a wounded veteran of a far-off war, brave and kind and decent, a little vain about his appearance, fond of a wager, and entirely loyal to his strange friend. He is the moral warmth of the whole enterprise, the ordinary good heart against which we measure the extraordinary cold mind. Without his steady decency beside it, the great intellect would be merely chilling. With it, the whole thing becomes a friendship we want to climb inside and live in. There is a small and famous puzzle about the doctor that his devoted readers have loved for generations, and it shows you exactly the sort of game they like to play. In one story, his old war wound is described in his shoulder, and in a later one, he speaks of it troubling his leg, as though the wound had quietly wandered across his body somewhere between adventures. It is, of course, simply a slip of the pen by a busy author writing quickly. But the faithful refuse to accept anything so dull, and have spent more than 100 years inventing elaborate and delightful theories to explain how a single bullet might have struck both places at once. They would not allow their friend to have been merely written. He must have been real, and so the contradiction must have a real and clever solution. The friendship between those 2 men is, in fact, one of the great friendships in all of literature, and it is the secret engine of the whole thing. On the surface, it is the bond between a brilliant, difficult, often impossible man and a patient, loyal friend who loves him anyway. But underneath, it is the warm human heart that keeps the cold, logical machine from ever becoming unbearable. We do not really return to those rooms, year after year, for the puzzles. We return for the friendship by the fire. We will come back to that, gently, before the night is through. Now, let us speak of the method itself, the famous art of seeing. The detective's great principle, the one he repeats in 100 ways, is that ordinary people look, but do not observe. They pass their eyes over the world and notice nothing. He, by contrast, sees everything, every scuff and thread and stain, and more importantly, he understands what each tiny thing must mean. A splash of mud of a particular color tells him which district you walk through. A callus tells him your trade. A worn cuff tells him your circumstances. Nothing is too small, because to him the smallest things are the loudest. He called this the science of deduction, And here is a small, delicious correction that the logicians among you will enjoy as you drift off. What he mostly does is not, strictly speaking, deduction at all. Deduction works from a general rule down to a certain conclusion. What the detective actually performs is something subtler, which thinkers call abduction. The art of leaping to the single best explanation that would account for all the strange little facts in front of you. It is reasoning backward from the clues to the most likely story. And the reason it feels like magic when we read it is that we are shown the dazzling conclusion before we are shown the quiet chain of reasoning that led to it. The trick is all in the order of the telling. One of his guiding principles is so elegant that it has long since escaped the stories and slipped into ordinary speech. He held that once you have stripped away everything that simply cannot be true, then whatever explanation is left standing, no matter how strange or unlikely it may seem, must be the truth. It is a beautiful tool for a frightened mind, 'cause it turns a vast and terrifying field of possibilities into a small and manageable one. You do not have to conjure the answer out of the dark. You only have to patiently rule out the things that are impossible, one by one, and let the truth reveal itself simply by being the last one left standing. He understood, too, that a clue is not always something that is there. Sometimes the most important clue is something that is missing, a thing that should have happened and did not. In one celebrated case, the entire solution turned upon the curious fact that a watchdog had not barked in the night, which told him in a single flash that the intruder could not possibly have been a stranger. To notice the absence of a thing, the silence where there ought to have been a sound, the gap where there ought to have been a mark, is a far rarer and harder kind of seeing than noticing what is plainly present. It is the very difference between looking and truly observing, carried to its quiet perfection. What is genuinely astonishing is how far ahead of real life this fictional man was. He dusted for fingerprints, studied footprints, analyzed the ash of different tobaccos, compared the typefaces of typewriters, examined documents and bloodstains and the chemistry of poisons, all as a matter of careful routine, at a time when the actual police forces of the world were doing almost none of these things. He practiced forensic science before forensic science properly existed. The fiction ran years ahead of the fact. And then something remarkable happened, which is one of my favorite pieces of lore. The fiction began to shape the fact. The man often called the founder of modern forensic science, a French criminologist, kept the detective's adventures close and is said to have urged his own students to read them, to learn how to truly look at a crime scene. The imaginary man taught the real ones how to see. There is a famous principle in real forensics that every contact leaves a trace, that you cannot touch the world without both taking something from it and leaving something of yourself behind. The great detective had been living by that exact truth for decades before the laboratories caught up. He was, before he was anything else, a kind of scientist, and his rooms were as much a laboratory as a home. Forever cluttered with beakers and acids and odd experiments, his long fingers stained with chemicals. There is a faintly unsettling little tale from the very first time we meet him, of his beating quite calmly at a body in a dissecting room, simply to study how bruises form upon the flesh after death. It is a small, cold detail, and a deliberate one. Tells us that his hunger for truth runs so deep and so dispassionate that it can stand at the very edge of the macabre without flinching. The same detachment that makes him so brilliant makes him, in certain moments, a little frightening. His profession, too, was one he had invented wholly for himself. He called himself a consulting detective and insisted he was the only one of his kind in all the world, a last and highest court of appeal in the detection of crime. When the official police, the plodding and earnest inspectors of Scotland Yard, found themselves utterly baffled, they would swallow their pride and bring their hardest cases to his door. And this became a pattern the entire genre would inherit ever after. The gifted outsider set against the well-meaning but unimaginative authorities. The lone genius who sees in a single glance what a whole department of honest men could not uncover in a month. There is a theory the detective once offered about the mind itself, and it is worth turning over slowly tonight, because it is stranger and more modern than it first appears. He argued that the human brain is like a small, empty attic, and that a foolish person crams it full of every kind of useless lumber, so that the knowledge they actually need is buried and hard to reach. A wise person, he insisted, stocks that attic carefully and keeps out everything that does not earn its place. He claimed, quite seriously, not even to know or care whether the earth went around the sun, because such a fact was no use to his work, and so he had deliberately chosen to forget it. It is easy to laugh at that, but pause on it, because in our own age of endless information pouring in from every glowing screen, the idea of deliberately, carefully choosing what not to know, of guarding the small attic of your attention against clutter, has become a quiet kind of wisdom. The great detective was worrying about information overload more than a century before the rest of us learned to. Connected to all this is the popular image of his memory as a vast palace of rooms, a place he could walk through in his mind to retrieve any fact. That technique of placing the things you wish to remember inside an imagined building and strolling through it is real and very ancient. The orators of old Greece and Rome used it to memorize enormous speeches, walking in their minds from room to room. It had been nearly forgotten for centuries. The modern retellings of the great detective have done more than anything else to bring that beautiful old memory art back into the world. It is a peaceful thing to imagine that quiet inner mansion of rooms where everything you have ever known is kept in its place. But the great mind had its shadows too, and it would be dishonest to leave them out. Between his cases, when there was no puzzle to seize him, the detective fell into a gray and restless gloom, a boredom so total and so painful that he could barely endure it. His mind was an engine built to run hot, and idleness was agony to it. And to escape that emptiness in the darker corners of the early stories, he turned to a drug, injecting himself to quiet the unbearable stillness of an unoccupied brain. It is a sad and very human detail, and it tells you something true. It's the same restless, brilliant mind that made him extraordinary also made ordinary peace nearly impossible for him to find, which means that his real enemy, the deepest one, was never any criminal at all. His true and constant adversary was boredom, the slow, gray tedium of a world with no mystery in it. Each case, when it finally arrived, was not just a job. It was a rescue, was the thing that lit the cold engine and gave the restless mind something worthy to burn on. There is something quietly poignant in that, in a man so gifted that the ordinary contentment most of us long for was, for him, a kind of suffering. He was not, by the way, merely a brain on legs, and this is often forgotten. The detective was also a formidable physical man, an excellent boxer, skilled with a sword and a single stick, and a practitioner of an exotic Japanese system of wrestling that let him, on at least one famous occasion, fling a much larger enemy to his doom. He was a master of disguise as well, an actor good enough to fool even his own closest friend, slipping into the skin of an old sailor or a humble clergyman so completely that no one suspected. The complete man was action as well as thought, the body trained as carefully as the mind. When he was not in motion, he had his own quiet ways of thinking, and the loveliest of them was music. He played the violin, beautifully and strangely, sometimes great composed pieces, and sometimes only soft, formless, drifting improvisations, drawing the bow slowly across the strings while he turned a problem over in the deep places of his mind. The music was the very sound of his thought, and it was also his comfort, vague, that soothed both his own restless soul and his friends' frayed nerves through the long evenings. There are few images in all the stories more peaceful than that of the great mind at rest, filling the lamplit room with low and wandering music, while the fog gathers softly outside the glass. He measured the difficulty of a problem, rather charmingly, by how long it would take him to think it all the way through, calling a hard one a matter of 2 or 3 pipes of tobacco. Settling himself deep into his chair, drawing his knees up beneath his chin, and vanishing entirely into a long, still smoke-wreathed silence until the answer at last arrived. Set the old habit itself aside, and what remains is something we have very nearly forgotten how to do: the deep and unhurried stillness of a mind given full permission to sit with a single question for a long, long while, undisturbed, until it quietly gives up its secret. It is a kind of meditation, really, and a deeply restful thing to picture as you grow heavy. And there was a quiet fairness in the way he saw the world, which is easy to overlook. His method made no distinction at all between the great and the humble. He read a duchess and a dustman by exactly the same signs, the same mud and calluses and frayed cuffs. And the truth he uncovered cared nothing for rank or fortune. In a rigid and deeply divided age, there was something almost democratic in that clear, level gaze, a mind that looked straight past every title and every costume of class to the plain human facts beneath. To the great detective, everyone was, first and last, simply a puzzle made of evidence, and every single puzzle was worth the solving. Now I want to dismantle, very gently, 3 things you think you know about him, because the truth is a wonderful lesson in how legends grow. Picture the great detective in your mind, and you almost certainly see a particular hat, a deerstalker with his flaps over the ears, and a flowing checked cape. Here is the secret: he almost never wears such a thing in the actual stories. That image was the invention of a gifted illustrator named Sidney Paget, who drew the adventures for the magazine that made them famous, and who simply dressed the detective in the country clothes he himself liked. The most iconic hat in fiction was an artist's quiet personal choice. Now picture the pipe in his mouth, that great, curved, drooping pipe. That, too, is not really his. In the stories, he smokes plain, straight pipes of clay and briar. The famous curved pipe was the invention of a stage actor named William Gillette, who played the detective in the theater and chose a bent pipe for a very practical reason, so that it would hang clear of his face and the audience could still see his expressions while he spoke. A piece of stagecraft became, forever after, part of the man. And now the most famous thing of all, the line that everyone in the world can quote. The crisp, knowing phrase, elementary, my dear fellow, the supposed catchphrase of the great detective. Search the entire canon, all 4 novels, and all 56 stories, and you will not find that sentence anywhere. He never says it. Not once. It was assembled and popularized later, on the stage and in the films, and it became so attached to him that the whole world now misremembers it as his. And that, more than anything, tells you the deepest truth about him. The legend grew so much larger than the text that it began to invent itself. The character escaped his author entirely and started writing himself in the imagination of the world. He needed, of course, a worthy enemy, for a mind that great cannot be tested by ordinary villains. And so Doyle gave him a single magnificent nemesis, professor of mathematics with a serene and terrible intellect, whom the detective called the very Napoleon of crime. It's a quiet spider sitting motionless at the center of a vast web, feeling every tremor of wickedness in the great city, organizing villainy with the same cold genius the detective brought to stopping it. He is the arch enemy, the eternal opposite, and yet here is a curious thing. K appears in startlingly few of the stories. K looms over the whole legend like a thundercloud, and yet he is barely there on the page at all. Hay's power is the power of a shadow, vast precisely because it is mostly imagined, and he is, in the truest sense, a mirror. The professor is everything the detective is, the same towering intellect, the same cold and patient logic. The same ability to see the hidden patterns beneath the surface of the city, turned in the opposite direction. He is the great mind pointed at ruin instead of rescue. This is one of the oldest and most powerful ideas in all of storytelling, the one we found in the dark city of the watchful bat as well. That the hero and the villain are often two answers to the same question, and that the only real difference between the great detective and the great criminal is the choice each one made about what to do with the very same gift. The clash between them led to the most dramatic moment in all the lore, and the reason for it is wonderfully human. By the early 1890s, Doyle had grown tired of his own creation. The detective had become so popular that he drowned out everything else his maker wished to write. The serious historical novels Doyle believed were his true work. He came to resent the man who had made him famous. And so, in a story published in the year 1893, he decided simply to kill him off, sending the detective and his great enemy together over the edge of a thundering waterfall in the mountains, locked in a final struggle, both vanishing into the gorge, gone forever. The public reaction was something that had never quite been seen before, and it is astonishing to think about. People did not merely feel disappointed, they grieved. There are accounts of readers wearing black mourning bands in the street, as though a real friend had died. The magazine that had published the stories lost something like 20,000 outraged subscribers almost overnight. Doyle was flooded with furious and heartbroken letters. A fictional man had died, and a nation went into mourning, and that fact alone, the depth of that grief, proved something extraordinary. The character was no longer just a character. To the public, he had become real. The pressure did not relent for years, and at last Doyle surrendered, defeated by his own creation. First, he told a tale set in the days before the fatal waterfall. It's a great brooding mystery of a spectral hound upon the moors, which let the detective live again in the past. And then, finally, he gave the public what they truly wanted, and revealed that the detective had never actually died at all. He had only let the world believe it, slipping free of his enemy at the last instant with that exotic wrestling art, and vanishing into hiding for 3 long years before quietly returning to his astonished friend. The author had tried to bury his creation, and his creation had simply refused to stay in the ground. Think about what that means, because it is the very heart of his immortality. The man who made him could not control him. The detective had grown more powerful than his own author, more beloved, more permanent. Belonged to the world now, not to Doyle. And once a character belongs to the world like that, the world will never let him die. He has been brought back to life in one form or another, more often than almost any other figure in fiction. Portrayed on stage and screened more times than any other human character ever invented. Every single generation, without fail, reaches back into the fog and pulls him out again and makes him new. And this is the secret of his endless reinvention. The reason he survives every era. Each age remakes him in its own image. There has been the gentleman of gaslit Victorian London, and the patriot of the war years, and the modern man of mobile phones and city streets. And even versions transplanted to entirely new countries and centuries. But the core of him never changes, and the core is timeless, which is why it always works. He is, in every version, a brilliant and difficult outsider who can look at a frightening, chaotic, senseless world and make it make sense. That hunger for someone who can do that never goes out of fashion, because the world never stops being frightening and chaotic and senseless. You can find his soul wearing the most unexpected disguises. There was, for many years, a wildly popular tale of a brilliant, bitter, miserable medical genius who solved impossible diagnoses the way the detective solved crimes. A misanthrope with a single loyal friend, an addiction to a painkiller standing in for the old drug, and who even lived, with a wink, behind a door bearing those same famous numbers, 221B, It was the great detective reborn in a hospital. The same restless mind, the same loneliness, the same desperate need for a puzzle and a friend. Once you learn to see his shape, you begin to find him everywhere. You will even find him, as we have already discovered on another night, beneath the cowl of the watchful guardian of a Gothic city. That grim figure, so often called the world's greatest detective. That title is no accident. Escaped watcher in his cave, full of evidence, turning a puzzle over and over until it yields. It's a direct descendant of the man in the armchair at Baker Street. The deerstalker became a cowl, and the foggy gaslit streets became a darker city still. But the bloodline runs straight back to the fog. And just as the detective has countless descendants, he had an ancestor too, for he did not appear from nowhere. Decades before him, an American writer of the macabre had created a brilliant, eccentric French gentleman who solved baffling crimes by pure force of reasoning, sitting in the dark and thinking his way to the truth. That earlier figure was the true first of his kind, the original reasoning detective, and Doyle knew it well and openly owed him a debt. In a sly little moment in the very first story, the great detective even dismisses that French predecessor as rather showy and inferior, which is a wonderful private joke, the new king gently waving away the old one on his way to the throne. From the great detective, in turn, descends nearly the entire vast genre of the mystery story as we know it. The clever Belgian with his egg-shaped head and his little gray cells. The sharp old village spinster who understands all of human wickedness from watching her quiet neighbors. The countless inspectors and amateurs and consulting minds who have filled a century of books. They are all, every one of them, children of Baker Street. He is the father of detective fiction. Almost every puzzle you have ever stayed up too late trying to solve traces its family line back to those two worn armchairs by the fire. Part of his enduring magic is everything we are never told, scattered all through the stories. The good doctor casually mentions other adventures he has never quite written up. Tantalizing fragments of cases we will never get to read. A hint of some affair too scandalous ever to record. A passing reference to a matter for which, he says, the world is not yet prepared. The most famous of these teasing little ghosts is a dark and unexplained business involving a giant rat from the island of Sumatra, a case named in a single line and then never told. These little doorways into rooms we can never enter make the whole world feel enormous, far larger than the 60 stories that contain it, stretching off endlessly into the fog in every direction at once. Those open doorways have proven irresistible, and for more than 100 years, other writers have walked straight through them, dreaming up brand new adventures for the great detective, sending him to meet every famous figure of his era and to solve every crime that Doyle himself never set down. He is among the most borrowed and reimagined characters in all of literature, endlessly continued by hands other than the one that first made him. The man who once tried to kill off his own creation has instead found that creation quietly multiplying long after his own death, told and retold and told again by the whole wide world forever. There is even a strange final tribute hidden in the law itself. For many years after Doyle was gone, his estate argued with real seriousness that the great detective could not yet belong fully to everyone, because in the very last of the stories, the character had been given new warmth and tenderness and feeling, and that these later, softer qualities of his soul were somehow still protected. It took until the year 2023 for the last of those stories, and so the last gentle pieces of his heart, to pass at last into the common ownership of all the world. Think of that for a moment. He was a character so vividly, so stubbornly alive, that the question of who owned his very emotions had to be settled in a court of law. But perhaps the strangest and most charming part of his lore is what his most devoted readers did with him, because they invented something the world had never seen before. They began to play what they fondly called the game with elaborate, mock-serious scholarship. Kay chose to pretend that the detective and his doctor friend had been entirely real people, that the good doctor had truly written the accounts of their adventures, and that Doyle himself was merely the doctor's literary agent, the man who had helped to get the true memoirs published. They wrote learned essays, puzzling over tiny inconsistencies in the stories, treating them as real historical problems to be solved. This was, by most reckonings, the birth of modern fan culture, decades before anyone had even invented the word for it. Ordinary people in love with an imaginary world, gathering to study it and expand it and treat it with joyful, deliberate seriousness. They formed societies devoted to him, the most famous of which took its name in the year 1934. From the band of ragged London street children, the detective employs in the stories as his eyes and ears, his unofficial little army of urchins. The name that had belonged to fictional children became the name of a real and learned society of grown admirers. Fiction and reality had begun, quietly, to trade places, and they have never stopped trading places. To this very day, letters arrive at that Baker Street address, written by people all over the world, addressed to the great detective himself, asking earnestly for his help with their troubles, or simply thanking him, or asking whether he is keeping well. For many years, a real person was employed to answer that mail on his behalf, replying gently that the detective had retired and was no longer taking cases. There is no purer proof of immortality than that. People write letters, in sincere hope, to a man who was never born, at a house where he never lived, and somewhere, kindly, the letters are answered. Now, let me return to the paradox I opened with, because it is the most human and moving piece of the whole story. The man who created this monument to pure reason, this god of cold logic, was himself a passionate, incredulous believer in the supernatural. In the later years of his life, Doyle became a devoted spiritualist. He attended seances and believed he could speak with the dead. He wrote earnest books defending the existence of fairies, and publicly championed a set of faked photographs of little winged creatures in a garden as genuine proof that fairies were real. The maker of the most skeptical mind in fiction was, in his own heart, one of the least skeptical men of his age. Sit with how beautiful and strange that is. Perhaps the great detective was the cool, clear, rational self that the warm and yearning Doyle wished he could be. Perhaps the perfect logician was a kind of dream of order, dreamed by a man who longed, more than anything, to believe in something beyond the visible world. The most rational character ever written may have been an act of longing by a deeply unrational heart. There is a whole gentle truth in there about how we create the things we most wish we had. We cannot leave without sitting for a while in the city itself, because the city is half the magic, and it is the part most made for sleep. The London of the great detective is a place of yellow fog rolling thick through gaslit streets, of hansom cabs clattering over wet cobblestones, of lamplighters moving from post to post in the dusk to coax the lamps alight, of warm windows glowing gold against the gloom. It is a city of shadow and lamplight in equal measure, where danger hides in the murk and reason shines out against it. The atmosphere is so rich and so enveloping that you can almost feel the cool damp of it, and it is one of the loveliest places in all of fiction to let your mind wander as you sink toward sleep. It is worth remembering, too, that these stories were always meant to be a comfort at the end of a day. When they first appeared, families would gather in the evening around the warm glow of the hearth and read the newest adventure aloud together. The rain on their own windows, the lamp turned low. The great city's dangers all safely contained within the pages of a magazine that could be closed whenever one wished. From the very beginning, the great detective was a fireside companion, a thrill that was somehow also a reassurance, exactly the sort of thing one reaches for as the night draws in and the world grows quiet and small. In listening tonight, you are doing a very old and very human thing, and at the center of it all, holding the whole warm little world together, is the patient landlady who keeps those famous rooms, enduring the chemical smells and the strange callers and the occasional bullet hole in her good walls with a weary, motherly affection. She is part of why the lodgings feel so safe, so much like a refuge from the fog and the danger waiting outside. For all that the stories venture out into darkness and crime, they always come home in the end to that cozy, cluttered, lamplit room with the fire banked low and the kettle warm and someone kind keeping house. It is one of the great safe harbors in all of fiction, and the door is open, and it is waiting for you tonight. And it matters, too, why he arrived in that city at exactly the moment he did, because there is real comfort buried in the answer. The age that made him was an anxious one. The world was changing faster than people could bear. Old certainties were dissolving. Vast cities were swelling with strangers, and real and terrible crimes haunted those same foggy streets in those same years. People felt, deep down, that the world had become too large and too dark and too senseless to understand. And into that exact fear walked a man who could take the most baffling horror, examine it calmly, and explain it completely, restoring order with nothing but the power of a clear mind. That is why so many have called the detective a kind of secular priest. The key, in an age that was quietly losing its old faith, he offered a new and different comfort. Not the promise that some higher power would set things right in the end, but the nearer, more graspable promise that a calm and careful human mind could make sense of the darkness here and now. Every one of his stories is, in its shape, a small, reassuring ritual. A frightening mystery enters the cozy, lamplit room. It is examined. It is understood. By the final page, the chaos has been named and explained and dispelled, and the world has been made safe and legible again. In this, he was the perfect hero for his particular moment in history, the great champion of an age that had placed its deepest faith in reason. It was a time that believed, with enormous and shining hope, that science and clear thinking could draw back the veil on every secret of the universe, that there was no darkness anywhere that the steady lamp of the human mind could not eventually illuminate. The great detective was that very hope, given a face and a name and a famous address. He was the living promise that careful observation and cool, patient logic could trespass even into the most shadowed corners of human wickedness and walk back out again into the light, with the truth held calmly in hand. This, I think, is the deepest reason the detective story suits us, and the reason it makes such fine company at the close of a long day. The form itself is a promise. It promises that confusion is only ever temporary, and no matter how tangled and frightening a thing may seem when it first walks through the door, there is an explanation waiting, and a patient mind can find it. The world of the great detective is a world where everything, in the end, makes sense. And how deeply, how achingly, we long for that to be true of our own. But here's the thing that keeps him from being merely a cold thinking machine. The thing that makes us love him rather than just admire him. Beneath all that ice, the great detective has a hidden and stubborn heart. More than once in the stories, having solved a crime perfectly, he chooses to let a guilty but sympathetic soul go free, because he judges that the strict letter of the law would be a crueler thing than mercy. He has his own private code, his own deeper sense of justice that sometimes overrules the rules. The greatest logician in fiction is, when it truly counts, guided by his heart. There was, famously, one person who slipped past all his defenses and earned his lasting, genuine respect, a brilliant and daring woman who, in a single early adventure, outwitted him completely and beat him at his own game. He spoke of her ever after with a quiet admiration he gave to almost no one. It was not romance, not exactly. It was the rarer and perhaps deeper thing of one extraordinary mind recognizing another as a true equal. And it was a small, precious crack in the cold marble of him, a glimpse of the warm human being living somewhere inside the legend. He even had a brother, it turns out, an older one, said to be even more brilliant than the detective himself, but so constitutionally lazy that he could not be bothered to leave his armchair to prove it. This elder brother held some quiet, enormous position in the government, so central that, the detective once suggested, he occasionally simply was the British government, all by himself, working it all out from the comfort of his club. There is a wry and gentle joke buried in that, about how the very cleverest mind in any room is sometimes the one with the least ambition to use it, content to know the answers and never to chase them. So, let us gather all of this together now, as your breathing slows and the room grows soft and warm around you. Why has this one man endured so completely, for so long, loved by so many, when so many other characters have faded? 'Cause he answers one of the oldest and most secret fears the human heart carries. The quiet terror that the world is chaos, that things happen for no reason, that the darkness has no shape and no explanation and no one who can read it. And against that fear, he stands as a calm and reassuring promise. Kay says that there is always an explanation, that the pattern can always be found, that a steady mind, looking closely and without panic, can make even the most frightening thing legible and known. And that is the gift I most want to leave you with tonight, as you lie there in the dark. In the small hours, you know, our worries swell up so large and so tangled and so senseless to mind, with nothing to occupy it, fills the attic with monsters. But remember the lesson of the great detective. Almost nothing is ever as mysterious, or as menacing, or as hopeless as it appears at 2 o'clock in the morning. There is an explanation. There is a shape to it. The fog that looks so impenetrable now always lifts by morning, and the thing that loomed so terribly in the dark turns out, in the daylight, to have a perfectly ordinary cause. The puzzle of your day will make sense when the sun is up. It does not need to be solved tonight. And there is one last gift, the warmest one of all, which is the truth I promised we would return to. For all his formidable solitude, the great detective was never truly alone. Beside the cold logic, there was always the warm friend in the other chair. The whole legend, underneath its puzzles and its fog, is really the story of two friends growing old together in a comfortable room, with the rain on the window and the fire in the grate and the kettle warm between them. The mysteries were only ever the excuse. The friendship was always the point. And you, lying there, are not alone in the dark either. So picture that room now, and let it hold you as you fall. The fire is burning low and orange in the grate. The rain is whispering softly against the glass. Outside, the great city lies wrapped in its blanket of yellow fog, its lamps glowing gentle and gold, all its mysteries quietly examined and explained and put to rest for the night. The violin is laid aside. The papers have stopped rustling. There are 2 worn armchairs drawn up close to the warmth, and the whole room is safe and steady and still. And here is a last and perfect piece of true lore to carry you over the edge of sleep. Because the end of the great detective's own story is the most peaceful thing imaginable. In his final years, the greatest restless mind in all of fiction did not burn out or break down. He simply retired to a small farm on the gentle chalk towns of the southern coast, in sight of the sea. And there, the man who had spent his life chasing the darkest puzzles of the great city chose, of all things, to keep bees. He spent his last quiet years tending his hives in the sun, listening to the soft, endless hum of them, watching the orderly little world of the honeycomb, and writing a small book about their care. The most brilliant mind of his age found his final peace in the gentle, drowsy hum of bees on a warm hillside by the sea. Let that be where your mind rests tonight. Not in the fog and the danger, but on that sunny, sleepy hillside with the soft hum of the hives, and the sea breathing slow below, and a great searching mind, at last, after a whole life of restlessness, completely and perfectly at peace. Nothing in any of this asks anything of you tonight, except that you rest. There is no mystery you must solve before morning. The fog will lift on its own. The day will make sense when the sun returns. Let the worries stay unexamined in their files until then, and let yourself sink down into the warm and the dark. And the very last thing I can tell you, quiet truth, the great detective spent his entire life proving over and over, is the most comforting one there is. There is almost always an explanation, and the thing in the dark is almost never as terrible as the dark made it seem. So let the mysteries of your day wait for the light. They will untangle themselves in the morning. Psst, now by the warm fire, with a friend in the other chair. Good night.